Steve, welcome. Really great to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
For sure. So for folks that maybe are unfamiliar, you've got a YouTube channel where you speak about all your work with real estate in Vancouver, in Canada, and then also a bunch of macroeconomics. And I'm very excited to dive into some stuff with you because it's not usual we get to speak with someone who has such a good, really in-depth understanding of a big component of the markets, real estate, but also a good macroeconomic framework. And so maybe just for myself and for others, how'd you pair those two? Were you interested in real estate first and then macroeconomics, or how did these things become, a one for you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because everybody goes, oh, you're selling real estate in Vancouver. What does that have to do with macroeconomics? Like, how come you're so, fascinated or always talking about central bank policy and stuff like that? Sort of for myself, it was kind of like in 2015 where, the Vancouver housing market's taking off. Everybody's trying to justify what's happening in the markets. And so, I just kind of went down this rabbit hole. It's just like, I'm a huge proponent of self-education, always learning, always questioning, always trying to get better. And for me, it was just like, listen, like if you want to understand a real estate market, I think you have to understand capital flows and you have to understand how the world works because like what we saw here in Vancouver, like we are a global city. And so we're impacted particularly by global events. And so like one of those global events was obviously what was going on in China with the capital flight in 2015, 2016, that pushed our housing market up tremendously. And I think I think if you sort of turn back the clock, sort of the warning signs were there. But anyway, so it kind of took me down this path. And I think now we're starting to see anyone that's been following along with financial markets, you can clearly see that, all these markets are moving now together, like particularly if you look at what's happened in this pandemic, right? Like global property markets are all moving almost in tandem. And so I think it's basically, I think you have to really understand the macro to sort of help you understand the micro, so to speak.
Yeah, completely agree. And so you've got just under 20,000 subscribers on your channel. In your view, what are they there for? What answers are they looking for?
It started sort of on the micro, maybe more just like, hey, listen, I was doing deep dive analysis on the Canadian housing market, right? I mean, like if you're here in Canada, there's really not a whole lot of information about housing markets that isn't completely biased. Obviously, the big banks push out their messages because it's in their best interest, the real estate brokerages, all that stuff. So for me, I just try to look at it and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Like, whether it's bullish or bearish, this is what I'm seeing, and you're free to make that sort of call. And then it sort of morphed into trying to help explain people and sort of provide like a financial education around helping people understand markets and why they're moving, right? And so, I mean, one of the fascinating ones here, again, it's sort of during the pandemic, was everybody, including our own government agency, was saying, hey, listen, markets are going to puke. Real estate prices are probably going to fall somewhat significantly. And we actually saw the complete opposite. And so, a lot of that was just explaining the policies and saying, hey, listen, look what central banks are doing. We've come in with massive fiscal stimulus, basically handing essentially helicopter money to households. And then, the central banks essentially funding that government spending through basically these QE programs. So trying to explain that. So I think people basically come, I guess, first and foremost for the Canadian housing picture, but then also sort of, I guess, the financial aspect of it, education as well.
Yeah. Well, prepping for this, I actually was like, okay, when did Steve start? It kind of was like, what do these first videos look like? How have they changed? And I actually stumbled across, you had a great mustache in the beginning there.
Yeah, that was, I think I must have started filming in Movember there. That was
like,
probably
this guy started this thing just to show off the mustache, or?
Yeah, no, that thing was going strong at the time, but it's really morphed into getting a little bit more away from, like, I think the channel really started obviously just on like Vancouver real estate because that was what I really, really knew. And then obviously, as your interests expand and as your knowledge base
Yeah.
expands, sort of wanted to just provide, share some of that back, share a lot of the resources that I learned from, and help people in any way that I can. Because I think everybody's working pretty hard in this life, and if I can help people understand the system, and so they can maybe protect some of that hard-earned capital, that's kind of my ultimate end goal with the channel.
Well, let's go there a bit because you say this thing's transitioning, and we can see that with the work you've done. More macro framework. So perhaps walk me and the listeners through what is at the most fundamental level. What is going on with the U.S. and Canada? What's that macro framework which you try to see this picture?
I look at it ultimately as what's happening, particularly over the last, really since the global financial crisis, is central banks are basically the financial system, as you know it, is kind of on life support, right? So you've got the situation where I think Ray Dalio explains it best, right? You've got monetary policy one, which is central banks lower interest rates. And that's sort of the mechanism that's used to, as you hit a recession, you lower interest rates to spur economic growth, to spur borrowing. And then you go into monetary policy two, which is kind of what we've seen since 2008. It's when, you basically cut interest rates to zero. You can't really cut them much further. So then you start doing quantitative easing, which is, again, basically the central banks purchasing up massive amounts of government debt in hopes to lower yields and push people further out on the risk curve and inflate asset prices. So that's monetary policy two. And then Ray Dalio, talks about monetary policy three, which is what I think we're in right now, which is that, monetary policy one and two are kind of reaching their limits. How much QE can you really do to actually stimulate? And what you're seeing now is that monetary policy three is essentially where the government comes in and does basically their own version of essentially monetary policy, where they basically just essentially drop helicopter money, start cutting checks to people, forgiving various little bits of debt here and there, and that essentially is all funded by the central bank. So they basically become one and the same entity. And so I think that's kind of where we're at right now. So what you're seeing really is we're in an era where central banks and the governments are saying, "Oh, there's no inflation. There's no inflation. We can't hit 2%. We're trying to hit our 2% target. We can't hit it." But meanwhile, you're seeing massive inflation in asset prices. And so that's kind of your typical signs of a currency devaluation. And so I look at it more of like, listen, like I think the governments are basically they are essentially devaluing the currency. And that's why we're seeing massive run-ups in house prices, particularly where I am, and in all financial markets, right? I mean, you look at the stock market. And so I think that's really where it's showing up. So that's kind of my framework. And I think if we look at this pandemic in particular, where we implemented monetary policy three, I mean, I think that Canada's money supply, I think, expanded by about 18%, year over year, which is the fastest pace, I think, in 30 or 40 years. Yeah. And then you've got the US, I think they're around 22, 23%, money supply growth.
Always got to be a little bigger, the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I mean, look at that and think, well, if you're expanding sort of your monetary base by say 20%, that has to show up somewhere. There has to be sort of a consequence or a reaction. And I think, like, hey, if you look at it, I mean, housing market here is up 20%. So I think that they're fairly correlated. It's a convenient coincidence.
Yeah, or an unfortunate coincidence, however you want to look at it.
Yeah.
So Tiff Macklin, pardon me, but I forget his official name. Chairman of the
Tiff Macklin, head of the Bank of Canada.
Head of the Bank of Canada, and then Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed. These guys, as much as we want to rag on them, they're not like. They are intelligent. They must see what's going on, and they dodge and they duke when asked questions, and they have this political speak, and they can, dodge any kind of question about that and say whatever they want to say. But they must see what's going on. And so we all wonder, well, what ultimately is keeping them from trying to fix the situation instead of just kicking the can down the road? And in your view, what is that? Is it just some innate human thing of, I don't want to be that guy that it all falls apart
Yeah.
on? Is it as simple as that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's like you've got this big system, right, which is larger than any one individual. It's larger
Mm-hmm.
than any one country. It's a global financial system, and everybody's trying to keep it basically on life support, trying to sort of keep the existing system and keep it going. Because, like, what does a reset look like? Nobody really knows, but like clearly we know that we're kind of on this unsustainable path. But like, what's the alternative, right? Like, no one's just going to say, okay, let's just blow it off. Like, I don't want to, like, I think they look at it and say, well, I don't want to be the one. Like, we're going to try to keep this thing happens. If there's some crisis that, that comes along and we can't fix it, then, I think crises are ultimately what trigger change. And until that, like, sort of next crisis happens where you can't really repair that system, then you'll probably see, I think, some sort of overhaul. And I think we're slowly, you can see, like, we're almost kind of slowly getting there. Like, there's all this talk now about central bank digital currencies and what that's going to look like. And so, I mean, I think even, Mark Carney, who was the former head of the Bank of England, basically said, listen, like, this system, this petrodollar system, as the U.S. reserve, U.S. dollars, the world's reserve currency. Like, this is not a sustainable path. So, like, it's out there in the open. Like, central banks have talked about and acknowledged it, but I don't think anyone's willingly going to force change. I think it's going to come through some sort of external event that will require change.
Yeah, and are you more concerned about that external event being, let's just oversimplify it, and then you can tell me that's not possible and we can break it down further, but are you more concerned about markets breaking or society breaking?
Man, that's a tough one. I I don't know which one kind of goes first. I think, like, you're seeing society.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we really feel it here, at least in Canada, where, like, housing is the number one issue. People feel left behind. I think that the number one thing is you're kind of taught when you're, growing up that, okay, if you go to school, you get an education, you work hard, you can have a house, raise a family, and you'll be, decently well off. You'll be okay. And I think what we're seeing now is, like, particularly here in Canada, like, that dream of home ownership for a huge chunk of the young cohort, millennials coming up, is just not realistic. And, they've been sort of sold this bill of goods. And it feels like the social contract is basically broken. And so I think that is becoming a pressing issue. And obviously, I think there's a reason why, the younger millennial generation tends to lean left politically, is looking for more government handouts, is looking for more sort of social justice, is looking for more taxes on the rich. And there's a reason for that. And I think that's because, they've been kind of left behind. That social contract has been voided. And so I think that's something that worries me. Like, if you keep on this existing track of higher and higher asset prices, it's going to come to a breaking point. So it's hard to say whether or not, markets will break on their own, or will society break prior to that. It's hard to say.
Yeah, so tied. So Canadians are well regarded as quite polite, hospitable, and generous and apologetic bunch. What would it take for Canadians to go to the streets and be protesting for something different? Is if the entire cohort of millennials in mass, of course not all of them, are honestly struggling, and let's just say that they're not owning homes, they're going to be renting, and they're having to swallow that pill. Would that cause them to go to the streets? Or are they going to, toughen up and they'll just be renters for the rest of their lives. Like, what would cause Canadians to go to the streets and ask for some kind of change?
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know. We're a polite bunch, right? So
Yeah.
I think we'll kind of be the last to really have the pitchforks out.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think we're seeing it politically. I think Canada is going further and further left. I think, like, if we look just at housing, right, which is the number one sort of hot button topic, the amount of policy changes over the last 5 years has been like unbelievable. Like, if you had gone back 10 years ago, you're like, oh, and I told you this was going to happen, these changes were going to come in, you would have said I was crazy. So, like, some of those changes are, in Vancouver and Toronto, you've now got a foreign buyers tax, right? Because the finger's been pointed at not monetary
Hmm.
policy, because the average person doesn't understand what a central bank is or who they are or what they do. They just look
It's
at it and
easy
say,
to say,
hey,
like, hey, those folks came and bought all my houses.
yeah, hey, those people, they look like they're from, China. They came in, they bought our houses. This is not fair. We need to put a tax on them. And so that was implemented in 2016. They then increased it again in 2018. Then they brought in what's called like a speculation tax, which is essentially, if you're not renting out the home and it's not your primary residence, we're also going to apply an annual tax on top of that. Then we brought in like empty homes taxes here in the city of Vancouver as well. And like a lot of these policies are also in Toronto. And now the federal government's coming out and saying, this year, that nationally they're bringing in basically sort of a foreign buyers tax, where, again, if you're a foreigner and you're not utilizing the real estate, renting out the house or actually living in it, at least six
Hmm.
months of the year, they're going to, tax you on an annual basis. And I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be effective, but you can see that policymakers are reacting to society, and these policies that I think would have been unimaginable 10 years ago are completely accepted and actually supported. And I think that we're probably not done.
Are policymakers reacting to the narrative that Chinese buyers are coming in inflating house prices, or are they reacting to hard data that shows that's actually what's happening?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, to be honest, the data that they're using, I don't really think captures like the true extent.
Hmm.
Just the way that they use the data, the way that it's structured. I mean, it's kind of a longer conversation, but it's not really an accurate reflection of what's happening in the market. So the government data, for example, say that foreign investment into the housing market is really just a tiny fraction. It really shouldn't be moving the market.
Hmm.
And so if you look at it from a data perspective, it doesn't actually really necessarily support like a foreign buyers tax. But I think people, realistic, and I'm working here on the ground, like, it is a significant factor. But a lot of the problem is that they're looking at, the government will look at it strictly and say, okay, foreign buyers purchasing, let's say Vancouver real estate. Well, they're just looking at, what does your passport say? Oh, well, the reality is a lot of people that come here, they already have their permanent residency status, or they've got some sort of family member that's already here that is a citizen, and so
Hmm.
they'll purchase real estate through them. So, like, it's not like they're coming here, like that money is ultimately earned offshore, right? So you're earning it
Hmm.
in a different jurisdiction. You're coming here and then purchasing real estate almost essentially as a hedge, right? Like, if you want to get your money out of a communist country in China, what better place to put it into a great democracy, safe, stable country like Canada? And so, you
With polite
basically,
people
you
that
have the,
don't go to the streets. Sorry to
yeah,
cut you off.
you've got locals here that are basically earning low wages, I would say, and they're competing with a global investor base. You are competing. It is a global property market. You're competing with people that are earning incomes globally that are obviously, you're going to earn a lot more in Hong Kong than you are in Vancouver. So, and locals are obviously struggling to keep up with that. So.
It's very interesting. I'm just thinking of the global arbitrage of labor, of how we've outsourced so much manufacturing to Asian countries because labor is cheap. And then now they're almost arbitraging this light regulation environment low housing prices, this stable democracy. It's like a very interesting swap when you start deregulating the entire globe through this globalization mechanisms we've had in place for a few decades now. And that's I almost wonder, kind of more in line with that question about narrative, do you think the Canadian policymakers are not really that opposed to this narrative as well, because it deflects some of the attention that their policies are enacting? Super low rates, monetizing a lot of the government debt, of course, is going to inflate housing. But do you think they're happy to have the attention on these foreign home buyers?
Um,
Or is that getting a little too
yeah,
conspiratorial?
yeah, no, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. I think it's just like it's kind of like an easy scapegoat, right? Like,
Hmm.
yes, it's a problem, but yeah, again, like it does not like there's zero discussion or talk about um, what the central banks are doing, right? Like
Like
the
zero
fact
zero.
there's like basically a zero dialogue, and I think the problem is like if you really unpack it, like let's be honest, like okay, you've got major media outlets that comment on it, like these reporters that are talking about it. Do these reporters really understand the financial system? Do
Hmm.
they really understand what a central bank does? Like quantitative easing, like what is that? I don't think like the average person understands it. And if you take a poll of your family and friends and say, hey, do you know what QE is? Like, there's gonna be no idea. I think a lot of people just don't really understand. So what you see in the narrative, right? They say, oh, housing is expected to um, continue to be hot, or we're expecting price growth in the housing market because of quote unquote low rates. They just say low rates. They never say, well, why do we have low rates? It's just that, oh, people just justify it. Well, yeah, like housing's up 25% this year because of low interest rates. Nothing we can do about it. It's like, well, hold on a minute, there is something we can do about it because the interest rates are actually being artificially manipulated
Hmm.
by our own policymakers. So this is a policy decision that we're making to set these interest rates. Essentially, people say it's a free market. It's not a free market if you have your central bank owning 40% of the government's bond market, which is what we have today in Canada. So it's not a free market. I think since 2019, the Bank of Canada, for example, has funded 90% of new government debt issuance. So
Wow.
it's the total manipulation of interest rates. So, but again, it's easier just to deflect and talk about if you're writing an article now in CBC News that's going out to millions of readers. It's much easier just to say, hey, low rates and people coming from overseas into the market. That's easy to explain to the average reader. It's much more difficult to explain the monetary mechanisms that are in place. And I think that if people really understood it, there probably would be pitchforks and riots in the street. But I think it's almost for good reason that it's designed to be complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, I often wonder that too, because oftentimes it's quite simple mechanisms, but the wording is so complex. You're like, well, what the heck does that mean? You look it up, you're like, oh, could have just said it a different way. It's almost
Yeah,
like
you
they're
can.
creating this vernacular.
It's easier just to call it quantitative easing than like money printing, right? Like, I mean, yes, I
Yeah.
know they're not necessarily like, okay, technically doing, QE is not technically money printing. I understand, people will try to get into those arguments, but like, it's basically like a version of like money printing, right? But like, so yeah, could you imagine if we say, hey, the Bank of Canada is printing this much money? Like, so they just say, we're doing QE, don't ask what that is. People are kind of lazy. They don't want to look into it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting for sure.
Printing money, giving it to the government. I mean,
Yeah.
that it is disingenuous to say it, and that's the problem. It's disingenuous to say it that simply because it's not exactly what's going on. But if you follow a dollar, the most of the dollars, as you say, end up with the government because they're buying the bonds.
Right. And we can look at this like even a little bit further because I think we talked at the beginning of your show, like monetary policy one, monetary policy two, monetary
Hmm.
policy three. Let's look at monetary policy 3, for example, like
And I'm
the
guessing there's no
willingness.
4, huh?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, 4 is not yet written.
They're
Um,
working on that.
yeah, exactly. 4 is when they own everything. Um, but like monetary policy 3 is again where basically the federal government essentially does a version of helicopter money. It's all funded by the central banks. Like in Canada here, could you imagine like, okay, this is one crisis. We had a crisis at the onset of the pandemic where financial markets were completely panicked. Prices were selling off. There was no liquidity. What did they do? They came out and said, well, Canadians, for example, you don't have to pay your mortgage. Don't pay your mortgage for the next 6 months. Just raise your hand. You don't have to pay it. And that program turned out to be extremely successful, at least in terms of arresting price declines and increasing household savings rates and all that stuff. And so to think in the next crisis that that policy won't be back, I think is nonsensical. It will be back, and we can talk about for example. The government here in Canada created a program called CERB, which was basically that if you got laid off during the pandemic, or if you saw a sort of a reduction in your usual working hours or your usual salary, you could basically apply very, very easily for a $2,000 per month paycheck. Every month, $2,000 comes right into your bank account. And there was a huge take up of this program. And, now the government, it's still going on now. It's been over a year now. So this program is still going, $2,000 per month. And the government ironically came out and said, well, hey, there was a lot of people that took advantage of this system that were maybe double dipping. They didn't actually lose any income, but they still took the $2,000. They actually came out and said, don't worry, you don't have to pay it back. And those that actually did say, hey, you know what? Oops, we over dipped. My bad. Here's the $2,000 or here's the $6,000 I collected during those 3 months. The people that actually sent it back, the government is actually saying, no, actually, you know what? It's okay. We appreciate the honesty. And they're going to mail you the check back so you can keep that money. So like that's
so
like
Canadian.
Yeah, it's the definition of like helicopter money, right? Like,
yeah.
And again, that's all funded. Like, where's this money coming from? Well, like it's basically just digits on a screen. The central bank, the government is going to run massive deficits, and the central bank is going to come in and help with debt issuance and keep interest rates low.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point of these things will be back, because you look at the .com bust, and especially I'm less familiar with the Canadian response to these, but in the US, lower the interest rates, and then you have the housing crisis, lower interest rates and print money, and now it's all those and helicopter money, as you're saying, going through these 3 phases, and we have these other programs. So the next crisis, we're going to have all of that and probably some more things we don't even have today. Why would you expect to have less? Like, of course, we're going to have all these same policies, but even more, which is kind of wild to wrap your mind around, but it makes sense if you think about in that arc as you just described. I'd like to ask you real fast about, because we're talking about Canada a lot, and this question again is about Canada, but also it's about all the other economies that aren't like the big 3 central bank base, because we've got the ECB, Europe, we got the BOJ, Japan, these are the central banks, and we've got the Fed at the US, who kind of are navigating global monetary policy. And so the question is to you, why is Canada handcuffed, and why must they follow what everyone else does?
Yeah. They really can't. They take their orders essentially from other central banks. Because Canada's such a small country, like on the global level in terms of like global GDP. Like Canada basically doesn't matter. So we basically inherit our monetary policy. Like if we start deviating and saying, hey, listen, we're going to start hiking interest rates from 0, we're going to go up to, we're going to normalize rates and get them up to 3%. Well, like, I mean, your Canadian dollar, your currency is going to strengthen significantly, which is going to like just destroy exports.
Can you explain that process real fast of why would the Canadian dollar strengthen in that environment?
Because basically, global capital markets look for like rates of return, right? Like stable economies, higher rates. So if I can get like a strong yield in Canada, for example, like obviously you'd have the bond market doing the same, right? So maybe all of a sudden you're looking at, let's say, this is a very simplistic way of explaining it, but like, I'm trying to think what the Canada 5-year bond is at. Let's say I think it's about 1% today. But if that all of a sudden goes to say 3 or 4% versus everywhere else it's yielding, basically 0. That's a much more attractive. Negative. Yeah, it's a much more attractive investment. So you'd have capital flowing into the country, which would ultimately strengthen your currency and then weaken your exports because you're Canadian. Like, you know what I mean? So if you're an export economy, all of a sudden it becomes much more expensive for other countries to buy Canadian goods, right? So there's always these
having responsible monetary policy, you're penalized.
Yeah, essentially. And then like it's almost like this race to the bottom where, Jim Rickards wrote a good book about it, calling it currency wars. And I think that it's funny enough because I think Ray Dalio at Bridgewater said that it was mandatory reading for everybody in their firm. And I think the book was written in, I think it was in 2013 or 2014. So he's a little bit ahead of the game in terms of calling it for sort of what it is and what it was, which is that everyone's trying to get in a world of globalization, everybody's trying to get a competitive advantage. So everyone's trying to kind of like, basically everyone's trying to like weaken their currency to sort of try to get a one-up in terms of exporting and to remain essentially competitive on that globalization scale. So everyone's trying to like subtly devalue their currency. And so it's kind of a race to the bottom, right? I mean, every central bank is basically trying to almost one-up each other. And we can just see it like everywhere you go, right? I mean, it's anyway, it's a fascinating topic. But
are you concerned looking forward about capital controls? And like Steve Saretsky, are you concerned in the next 10 years? Do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit out of my realm of expertise, but, certainly smarter people than I've read and followed and listened to. I mean, they're certainly of that viewpoint that, it's inevitable. I think one of the guys that I really like is, Russell Napier. He's done a lot of, great commentary on this. Yeah, he believes that's going to be an issue. All I know is that, you've got global debt to GDP at about 350%. So it's never been higher. You've got too much debt and you've got really low economic growth. So basically the goal is from policymakers and central banks, basically their entire goal is, listen, we've got global debt to GDP at 350%. How do we either increase GDP or lower the debt ratio? And basically by doing that is, you kind of have basically, there's 3 outcomes. Number one is you can default, which I think it's pretty clear through all the policy decisions that we made over the last 12 months that that's not an option. That's not the option that they're going for.
They're not looking at that one. No.
Yeah, they're not looking at that one. So they're not looking for like a Great Depression 2.0 where, hey, let's let asset markets fall by 50% and let's just erase all these debts. Let's get mass defaults. They're not looking at that. So that's number one. Number two is you can try to grow your way out. I think that's extremely difficult to do when you've got again, aging demographics, and you've also got a mountain of debt, because debt is basically deflationary. It kind of weighs down society. So that's number two. So it's really hard to grow your way out. Number three is to basically inflate your way out. And I think that's what we're doing right now. Now, the government will tell you that there's no inflation, that, oh, it's, below 2%. But what you can see right now is they're trying to let inflation run hot. So the central banks are coming out and saying, hey, listen, we have a 2% inflation target, but we're willing to let it run hot, because we need to because we've been missing our target for the last 10 years, whatever. So they are trying to basically inflate their way out. So their goal basically is, listen, we're going to buy as much government debt as we need to. That will basically, their hope is anyways, that nothing will break. So their hope is that we will keep government bond yields in this really tight range. Let's call it, 1.5%, whatever. And let's try to keep GDP growth at 2.5%, while we pin yields at 1 or 1.5%. So realistically, so that's what the goal is. And so I think that in order to achieve that is, number one, they're going to let the economy run hot. Number two, they're going to buy as much debt as they need to basically make sure that yields remain suppressed. And number three is basically you have to have, what that means is basically it's a version of financial repression where there is, like, they essentially remove that free market. And it's the central banks that are basically dictating. So they come out, and the central banks, this is not like a conspiracy theory, right? Central banks have come out and said, hey, listen, we're going to do yield curve control. It's in our toolbox. And Bank of Japan's already doing yield curve control, but, the Fed and Bank of Canada, for example, officially aren't, but they can come out and say, listen, we're going to do yield curve control. We're going to tell, if the 5-year, 10-year bond, eclipses 1.5%, we're going to buy. We're going to target at 1.5%. And if GDP or if inflation is running at, let's say, 2.5%, and your yield is 1.5%, well, it's a real loss it's a negative 1% interest rate. And so I think that's the goal, and that's my view, anyways. I mean, I think we could be in a scenario like that where maybe it's for the next decade potentially. You have real negative interest rates.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just as you said, it's simple process of elimination. They're probably not going to default. The restructuring, we're not so sure about. It seems like it's inflation. And for folks that, you walk through it pretty clearly, but for folks that might not understand these mechanics, could you explain a little bit deeper of why is inflation good if you have debt, and it's bad if you are saving, say you have like a bank account?
Yeah. Well, I mean, inflation's great. Let's keep it simple here. Let's say you have a piece of real estate. I'll use US because the US is probably the best example. But, let's say you bought the asset for $500,000 and you took out, $400,000 mortgage on it, fixed for the next 30 years. Well, that debt, that $400,000 is fixed. And your monthly payment is whatever, $1,500 a month. But if you've got inflation running at 2 or 3% per year, the amount that debt is fixed, right? So to pay back that debt is basically diminishing every year, right? Like it's becoming worth less and less and less. So you can imagine in like 20 years, like what's the value of a $400,000 mortgage? Like it's going to be nothing, because like, generally speaking, is your income should also be somewhat tracking inflation. So if your income's going up 2% per year, it becomes easier and easier to repay that fixed debt. So that's kind of the idea behind inflation. And you look at it from governments, right? Like governments have massive,
more than 400,000.
Yeah, they've got massive amounts of debt. You can only imagine a scenario where every year things got cheaper and cheaper. Well, the cost of that debt is going to become more burdensome to service, because that, if things get cheaper and cheaper, that probably means less and less tax revenues coming in. But meanwhile, your debt pile is the same and actually becoming, again, almost bigger because the value. So it's the governments, I mean, are the biggest debtors in the world. And so for them, it's certainly beneficial to have some inflation. So the value of that debt becomes worth less every single year. Now, obviously, this is extremely burdensome on the average person, people in banks. So let's take another simple example is you can lock up your money today, particularly for like retirees. You lock up your money,
Mm-hmm.
you're trying not to take a whole lot of risk. So you're like, well, I'm going to just put it into, I'm going to take, $100,000 that I've got here in my savings. I'm going to put it into a GIC, guaranteed investment certificate. GIC is earning, like, if you're really lucky today, you might get 1%. So you might get 1% on your GIC savings instrument. Well, again, if inflation's running at 2% per year, it means every single year your return on that savings or that investment is negative 1%. So your savings are basically being eaten away every single year. So that's extremely difficult on people with no assets. Like, even if you're just an income earner, and you're trying to save, for example, let's say you're trying to save like a down payment on a house. Every single year, like, your savings, not only is the price of the real estate is going up, let's say 5% per year, but your savings for that down payment is declining by 1% per year. So it becomes extremely difficult. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. And I think it's pretty evident to anyone watching this interview is that you're seeing this massive wealth inequality, this social divide where, again, people that are sort of well off, they have assets, those assets are going up in value. And then you have a portion of society that doesn't have any assets or very little assets, and they have a little bit of savings, but those little bit of savings are being basically evaporated through all the money printing and through the inflation.
Mm-hmm. So I want to end on, you spend a lot of time working. I mean, you're a realtor, so you speak with a lot of different people about their finances and their dreams and the markets and real estate. Are a lot of folks bringing these elements into the picture, or are they more just like, I need to get in, things are crazy? So I guess the question is it more of a visceral or emotive, like I just feel desperate, I need to do something? Or is it like, man, inflation's potentially coming, it would be great to take on some debt right now?
Yeah, no, it's a big question. I mean, I would say, like, my clients typically tend to be more educated because, they obviously know where I'm coming from. They're reading a lot of my work or my videos or whatever. So a lot of them tend to be, I have a lot of clients like in the finance space, a lot of portfolio managers and stuff like that. So we tend to see eye to eye. And so for a lot of them, it'll be like a financial decision of like, hey, listen, like, we want hard assets. We think that, the government's basically debauching the currency, and they're going to do everything they can to support real estate. So I want to get in, I want to have a portion of my net worth into the real estate market. So that's one side. And then I get the other side of the other portion of my clients where it really is just an emotional need. If you think about, again, general societal behaviors and things that we've been taught growing up, is that you go to school, you get a degree, you get a job, you start a family, you buy a house. Like, that's the track. That's what most people are taught to do. And so for a lot of people, especially when they're starting families, they want that house. And again, and that's why we talked about in this interview, is that part of the social contract seems to be breaking because people do have this fear of missing out. We're like, oh my gosh, like, every single year real estate here is going up, 10, 15%. And like, yeah, I'm getting a 2% wage increase, but like, that's not keeping up with like the pace of these house prices going up. So there is a desperation and there is a fear that if they don't pull the trigger, they might never have a backyard for their kids that they can truly call their own. Like, I don't think there's a lot of people out there that aspire to be renters indefinitely for the rest of their lives. Like, most people at some point want to be able to own their own home and raise their family and have that stability. And that's just like a social thing that's built into our DNA. And again, that's why I do worry, obviously, about some of these policies and kind of where we're going. Is that hope for a lot of people is fading.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the work you do with your channel, and especially because I think that education component is a really big part of not feeling completely cast aside with the wind. It's like, okay, if I understand these forces perhaps a little better, I can more accurately assess and have my decisions and go forward. So on that, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us. Where can folks find, and we've alluded to your channel a million times, so like what's the title? How do they find it? And are you on social, or where other places can people find your work?
Yeah, probably most active on Twitter and YouTube. So you just at Steve Saretsky on both those platforms, and super active on there. So you can kind of just reach out to me, and happy to have a conversation with anyone, even if it's just kind of chit chatting.
Awesome. And then your YouTube, I believe, is the Saretsky Show.
Yeah, but I think if you go into YouTube and you just type in like Steve Saretsky, it'll pop up there. So.
Okay, awesome. Great. Well, thanks for joining today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on. That was a lot of fun.